Welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful guest today. Gary Lachman is the author of 21 books on topics ranging from the evolution of consciousness to literary suicides, popular culture, and the history of the occult. He has written a rock and roll memoir of the 1970s, biographies of Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, Jung, Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky, Emanuel Swedenborg, Uspensky, and Colin Wilson, histories of Hermeticism and the Western inner tradition, studies in existentialism and the philosophy of consciousness, and about the influence of esotericism on politics and society. He writes for several journals in the UK, US, and Europe, including Fortean Times, Quest, Strange Attractor, Fenris Wolf, and his work has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, Times Educational Supplement, Guardian, Independent on Sunday, Sunday Times, Mojo, Gnosis, and other publications. He lectures regularly in the UK, US, and Europe, and his work has been translated into a dozen languages. He has appeared in several film and television documentaries and on BBC Radio 3 and 4, and is on the adjunct faculty in transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before becoming a full-time writer, Lachman studied philosophy, managed a New Age bookshop, taught English literature, and was a science writer for UCLA. He was a founding member of the pop group Blondie, and in 2006 was indicted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lachman was born in New Jersey, but since 1996 has lived in London, UK. And it is my particular pleasure to have you with us because I'm a big fan of your work, and especially on Madame Blavatsky. And we're so excited to talk to you today and hear your presentation, and then maybe ask questions after after the presentation. So turn it over to you. Thank you for so much.
Well, thank you so much for that. And let me get this. You have to enable my screen sharing. Okay.
Just a second.
Okay, sorry, but thank you very much for that. And it's a pleasure to be here. Well, be with you virtually. I'm the other side of the planet, but all that. Let's see if this is this working now. Okay, there we go. Okay. Share, right. And yeah, let's go slideshow from the beginning. Right, okay. So yes, we're going to talk about the Silver Age, and this is this period in Russian history here from 1890 to just about World War I. I mean, different people have placed it ending at different times, and beginnings and endings are, the bête noirs of people who write about history, because you could always trace something back a little bit further, and so you have to start it somewhere. And it's more or less in the general kind of fin de siècle period, the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And for many people, the 19th century ended with World War I, even though that happened in the 20th century. Because that old world, that old Europe, was no more after World War I. I mean, in terms of Russia itself and Austro-Hungarian Empire and other, even the British Empire and so on and so on. So just about sort of the 1890s into beginning of World War I. And this is a photo of St. Petersburg. I think it's about 1900. And it was happening in St. Petersburg, but it was also happening in Moscow. And I've just copied this paragraph from some of the different places where I've written about this. During this time, St. Petersburg, the city of white knights, and its rival Moscow plunged into an apocalyptic orgy of esoterica, magic, and erotic madness. And that sounds really cool and exciting. And it was really over the top. A lot of it was what we would call transgressive. It was going against the norm of the time. And we'll get on to how it was sort of this antinomian time where radically different sorts of things were coming together. But this kind of occult revival that started up in the 1870s, 1880s with Madame Blavatsky, who I'll point out soon. This was happening in other cities in Europe at the same time. London had its own kind of occult underground with groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and people like the later Nobel Prize winning poet W.B. Yeats was member of that, and Aleister Crowley. I don't know if you know him. You might know him vaguely from goth rock or heavy metal kind of stuff, but he was this dark magician in the late 19th or early 20th century in London. He was involved in this kind of stuff too. So, and France, Paris had its own occult scene too. And it's mostly from Paris, from France, that the kind of occult sensibility that informed the Silver Age, this mystical, magical kind of atmosphere, came from France, and we'll get on to that. But and it seemed to reach a kind of really feverish intensity in Russia. And again, this may be due to something that we talked about, or we mentioned before the talk started officially, that there in Russian sort of culture, it seems to take things from other cultures and then give them strange twists and turns and turn them into something else. And this may be something that took place when the influences coming from the West reached St. Petersburg and Moscow, and were sort of heightened up a couple notches. You know, they turned it up to 11. You know, it sort of went a little bit further than what they had. And this is supposed to be a characteristic of the Russians themselves. And they have to excuse me. I'm probably going to litter this talk with cliches, but this is supposed to be one of the characteristics, is that they take things to extremes. It's either all or nothing. It's heaven or hell, or it's, you know, it's the apocalypse or it's the abyss. But they don't do well with this lukewarm in between. Which is the kind of Western bourgeois compromise. You know, in order to just keep, you know, normal life going, we have to compromise between the extremes. And the Russian sensibility seems to be one where it has to just go, you know, to the edge. It has to take it to the edge all the time. And again, this was something that seems to be coming to the fore at this time in Russia. And but again, it was this strange time of excitement and feverish atmosphere. Around things like the occult and magic and spiritualism and decadence and transgressive things and weird sex and drugs and all that kind of stuff that's still very popular today, but also had a deeply serious religious sensibility and a great passion for truth. Truth is something that was very much one of the things that drove many of the Russian thinkers from this time to the edge or to the extreme, because they had I mean, one of the stories told about this time by Nikolai Berdyaev, who we'll get on to later on, is a Russian philosopher who was around at this time. And this, I don't know where the story originates, but these intellectuals are at a cafe, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and the cafe owner wants to close up, and he says, "Gentlemen, please, you know, can you go home?" And he said, "We can't go home. We haven't decided whether God exists or not." And so they have to keep going until they answered that question. So, I mean, I don't know who stays up 3 o'clock in the morning now to do that. I mean, we don't, you know, we leave it up to bus hoarding. So if you're in London, you would have seen these on the buses. They had signs by the humanists saying, "Oh, you know, God probably doesn't exist, so don't worry about it." So we got this one down. But back then they were really excited about this. And this is about this sense of seriousness and a kind of absolute deep pursuit of the truth and the reality. But it was, again, it was a time of great creativity, and towards the end of it, there was kind of a Russian invasion into the West with people like Sergei Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is something that kind of germinated and came out of this time. You talked about paganism. It's full of all this Russian paganism and this notion of a prehistoric ancient Russia, which was one of the preoccupations then of that time too. But just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from in writing about this, is the most recent book, the one you've been reading, is Return of Holy Russia. So I write about the Silver Age, obviously, in there, but I've also written about it in other contexts. Madame Blavatsky, Marina mentioned, she sort of, a lot of her ideas got this thing going. She was a Russian, she left. She wasn't in Russia at the time of the Silver Age. In fact, she dies in 1891 here in London, not too far from where I live. But she's the one who kickstarted this occult revival, a mystical revival, and also, again, a serious pursuit of religion and world religions. I mean, this notion of a kind of ecumenical idea where you can get the different religions together and talk to each other. This was something that really came out of Blavatsky's work and the Theosophical Society. Famously, she was about trying to bring the different religions together into a kind of unity and a conversation, at least, and all that. But her ideas are very influential at this time. And the other book there is In Search of Peter Uspensky. And Uspensky is best known as sort of the most eloquent exponent of the work of G.I. Berdyaev, who's the gentleman there next to him with the impressive mustache. And Berdyaev wasn't Russian, he's Greek-Armenian, but he came sort of to prominence. So his public mission starts in Russia at the time of, World War I has just sort of been declared in Moscow. And he was a spiritual teacher, an esoteric teacher. Like Blavatsky, he has this very kind of ambiguous, curious past where we don't quite know exactly where he was and what he was doing at different times, but he says he traveled around the world like Blavatsky said she did. She went to Tibet, and Berdyaev went into monasteries and encountered sort of sacred brotherhoods in Central Asia and learned a variety of different kind of spiritual practices and brought those to the West through the help of Uspensky, who was a very popular writer and journalist in St. Petersburg and Moscow at this time. He was writing for many of the major newspapers, and he wrote books about the occult, about the fourth dimension, and dreams and tarot and things of that sort. And he too was one of the characteristics of the Russians in general, and of this period too, is this notion of the kind of the pilgrimage. There's a search for truth in the sense of going inward and looking for it, but it actually is a physical kind of journey as well. It's a quest out into the world. And there was a very popular book in the late 19th century called The Way of the Pilgrim, and it's an anonymous account of this pilgrim's journey through the Ukraine, Siberia, and other parts of Russia on foot, repeating what was known as the Jesus prayer. And I don't know if you've read parts of the book where this whole talk about the Hesychist tradition, which is this kind of mystical tradition within the Orthodox Church. And this prayer was part of that. It's kind of like the equivalent of an Eastern mantra, where there's a kind of Om Mani Padme Hum, you sort of repeat that. And the Jesus prayer is, Lord Jesus, save me, and so on. And you repeat this repeatedly, and all this, and it generates a kind of mystical meditative state. And so this notion of an actual physical pilgrimage and a kind of inner quest as well is part of this notion of what was happening in the Silver Age and in Holy Russia in general. And as I said, the there's many influences came, and many influences within Russian culture itself that led to this. I mean, the whole century, the whole 19th century leads up to this with all the, what are we going to do about the serfs? I mean, it's like sort of the main question that runs throughout that whole century, and a variety of different, you have the beautiful souls of these romantic characters who believe if they act in this kind of saintly, idealistic way, they can teach by example, and they'll be a moral exemplar, and this will have a kind of radiation effect around them, and eventually this would help to change things. And then you have the new men, who are the ones who precede this generation, the Silver Age, and they're these very practical Western utilitarian thinkers who want to take scientific tools in order to effect change, to basically change Russian society and to Westernize it rapidly. And they're the ones who are depicted in novels like Dostoyevsky's The Devils, and they're these nihilists who basically disrupt everything, and they just wreak havoc wherever they go. And there's a reaction to that, this is kind of sets the ground. I mean, Dostoyevsky he's in the background to the Silver Age. His novels like Brothers Karamazov and The Possessed and The Idiot and all that, they're presenting various different kinds of visions of this this kind of religious revival that he feels is necessary in order to, well, not only to save Russia, but basically save the world. So you have all that, but then again, this whole idea of Russia taking in something and creating something new with it. And the two ingredients I'm going to present here are French symbolism and German anthroposophy. And the fellow on over here is Charles Baudelaire. He's a French poet, famous for a very thin volume of poems called The Flowers of Evil, but it actually revolutionized poetry and started the whole aesthetic movement in Europe known as Symbolism. And symbolism is basically the idea that something stands for something else. It's a metaphoric way of looking at things. Something stands for something else, and it's not just in a sign kind of way, a one-to-one correlation, like the arrow points to the exit. It's something that's elusive and suggestive, and it creates an aura of a possibility around things. And Baudelaire read the Swedish savant Swedenborg, who started out as a scientist in the 18th century, but then went through a strange psychological crisis in his 50s when he had visions of Christ, and the angels took him for journeys to heaven and hell and to other planets and things of this sort. And he became a religious visionary, and he wrote a variety of very long books with these very sober accounts of these visionary experiences he had. But he developed this notion of what he called correspondences, in the sense that the physical things on the earth correspond to spiritual things in the higher realms. And a rose is a rose is a rose, Gertrude Stein said, but actually no, for Swedenborg, a rose is an emblem of God's love or something along those kinds of lines. And Baudelaire sort of took that idea and he played around with it being a poet, and he created this notion of a metaphoric way of sort of writing about the world, where things in the world stand for other things. And there were other ingredients he borrowed from Edgar Allan Poe and the German writer E.T.A. Hoffmann, this notion of synesthesia, where the senses blend, where you smell colors, or you see sounds. And so there's a whole hazy, kind of vague, elusive, suggestive atmosphere. And Akim Volinsky was the Russian literary critic who introduced these notions these ideas into the Russian literary world at that time. And again, as you know, I mean, Russia had been borrowing from France for centuries already. It was part of a long tradition. It wasn't that new. And what was coming from France then was this decadent, overripe, kind of a mystical hedonism in a certain way. Again, it's the way it's antinomian, we're opposites, where the senses and the spirit kind of comes together. But a much more sober sort of ingredient here comes from Rudolf Steiner up there, who, if you remember the actor Jeremy Irons, I always thought he would have played a good Steiner. But Rudolf Steiner started out as a Goethe scholar. He's basically a German, professor. He could lecture on practically anything. And he too, in his early 40s, he sort of transformed himself from a sort of lecturer on Nietzsche and Hegel and Kant to a theosophist. And he became the head of the German branch of the Theosophical Society, which had been founded by Baron Blavatsky in New York in 1875. And he infused it with a lot of German idealism, philosophers like Kant and Hegel and so on, but also was heavily Christianized. He was what we would call Christocentric, his vision of what he later called Anthroposophy, which is his development from Theosophy. He left after around 1912. But Steiner was very influential on Russian culture and Russian intelligentsia at this time. And one reason they didn't take to Madame Blavatsky as much is that she was very critical of Christianity. And the Russians are very Christian. I mean, they're more Christian than the Christians. So they were very, very Christian. And Steiner recognized them as Christ's people. He said that, he said the Christ impulse is in the Russians. And so they liked what he had to say. And one of the things that he had to say was in a series of lectures that he gave in 1906 outside of Paris, a suburb called Passy. And it was about what he called kind of what you might call the Russians, the mission of the Russian nation or the Russian soul. And Steiner had this vast system of kind of spiritual and esoteric ideas. But one of the things that he talked about was different nationalities had different kind of missions in the evolution of consciousness on Earth. And the Russians, in the Russian people, he saw the sprouting of what he saw this new cultural epoch was coming. And it was sort of the end of the West. The Western epoch was the development of the independent ego, the independent I. And this was something that actually, we had achieved very well, and it actually got too well. It's too, as I say in the book, the I had turned into the me And so, this kind of gluttonous, me. And the Russians had this more, it's the we. The Russians think of the we rather than the me. And it's the togetherness, it's the sobernos, it's everyone, together. We're all in this together. Sort of sensibility. And Steiner saw this as kind of the early sproutings of this new stage in human consciousness that would be another millennia or so. It would come to full bloom, but in the Russians it was sprouting. And he at the series of lectures he gave, many of the people that were very influential in the Silver Age were there, and they agreed. They too had this notion of this sense that Russia had this fantastic destiny, and this is again part of this notion of Russian universalism, where Russian embraces everyone. We embrace everyone, and we're open, to all, kind of thing. And this was something that they took back from his lectures, and then he continued at different times. He gave lectures other times, and many Russians came to stay with Steiner at the anthroposophical headquarters in Switzerland. So these were some of these Western influences that impacted on this time. And I said it was this time. I said it's antinomian and apocalyptic atmosphere. It was very tense atmosphere. There was a sense of expectancy. Something was going to happen. And again, you have the whole century of the problem of the serfs and different attempts to change this seemed impassable and immutable system in Russian society, where, going back to Catherine the Great, she was trying to do something about it and realized actually it would never work. If you free the serfs, the landowners would rebel and all this kind of thing. So we basically have to keep the lid on it. And everything sort of had frozen into place, a little bit tinkering here and there. And it just, the pressure, I'm mixing metaphors, but, the pressure on the pressure cooker grew and grew and grew until finally that people were expecting something to happen. And obviously in the political sense, a revolution there, but it was also in some kind of, one of the things I say in the book about when the Russians, the Roerich clan, when Vladimir I converted to Greek Orthodox Christianity, one of the things they really picked up on was apocalyptic sense, the sense of sort of history has a destination. It's heading towards something. And it's not progress in the Western sense. It's a kind of mystical denouement. There's going to be the second coming. This transfiguration is going to actually take place. There's a very literal sense to it in many ways. And we'll get onto that in further down the line if I get to Nikolai Fedorov, with this notion of the transfiguration or the resurrection of the dead, which is part of this mystical tradition of the church. That it's kind of muted in the Western church. It's in there, but nobody really talks about it that much. But in the Eastern church, it was something like, well, this is like serious business. If this isn't really what it's about, then what is it about? And one of the ways I would say you can tell the difference is in the Russian church, Christmas isn't as big a holiday as Easter, because everybody gets born, but not everybody comes back from the dead. So there's something it's more special about Easter than Christmas, because it is like this transformative event, and many of them took it literally. So there was this heightened expectancy of something happening, and the end times, or the sense of the end times, it always brings with it this notion that all the rules are abrogated. All the pieces are knocked off the table, or all the rules are broken, and you can basically do without will and do what you want. And this is where you have this that I mentioned earlier, this time where these kind of opposites are blending together. And one example of it is Rasputin. He's a cliche, but he's one everybody knows, and he's known as the Holy Devil. The old American biker gang, the Hell's Angels, is another opposites coming together. And in the cliche, Hammer films about him, he's this profligate and lecher and Satan, and he's actually planning to get greater and greater power, and he's being inappropriate with all the women around him all the time, and so on and so on. But yes, he as far as I can tell from the different biographies of it, yes, he liked sex. He was very forthcoming about that, but he was really holy in the sense he really did believe in God and the healing powers that he supposedly possessed, and there seem to be, to me at least, sufficient accounts to give them, due, stemmed from not from him himself. He would say that he was a conduit. He was a channel for these, and this was something that other Russian religious characters at this time were able to do as well, or said they were able to do. But you have that sense in Rasputin, and then you have these other extremes here. And one is a novel by Mikhail Artzabashev that isn't well known, but it's this kind of Nietzschean, pagan, free love, free expression. The Sanin is a character who sort of breaks all the rules of propriety and society, and he's just forthcoming, says what's on his mind, and has this great pagan love of nature and just life and all that, and doesn't worry about. And when a friend of his commits suicide, he says, "Well, one less fool in the world," but cheerfully. And so it's this kind of, but then you also again you have these characters. I forget this Starets name, but this is just an example of these holy men that would, again, this pilgrimage notion, who would travel around the country, and they impressed by their own spiritual kind of power, their own sort of gravitas. They didn't hold any position of power in the hierarchy in the church, but they had mana. They had this power within them, and they were able to bless, and they would just travel around like a Buddhist monk, and they would be fed by the different places they went to. So again, you had this time where all these things kind of mixed up, and then this notion of the apocalypse that was on its way. And sadly, in one way, it was not exactly the religious apocalypse that people were expecting, but some other. So here we go. So one of the people who were very, very influential around this time was Vladimir Solovyov, and he's Russia's first philosopher. And what I mean by that is not that people before him didn't think about questions that we would consider philosophical, but they were sort of religious thinkers or moralists or social critics or novelists like Dostoyevsky. And Dostoyevsky considered one of the sort of fathers of existentialism, even though he didn't write philosophical tracts. But Solovyov sort of used the tools of Western philosophy. He wrote philosophical tracts, and he took on those kind of questions that are part of the Western philosophical canon. And I mean, this is actually rather late. This is the 19th century. It's the late 19th century. So one of the reasons for that is if the previous century, there actually were philosophy was made illegal.
Gosh, it's okay, baby. It's okay.
Sorry, I'm hearing somebody. Okay, philosophy was made illegal in the universities early in the 19th century because it fomented thought, it fomented critical thought, and so you had. Earlier in the 19th century, you had sort of people like Dostoyevsky, who was this romantic, he was known as the Faust, this Russian Faust, and he was this romantic character who gathered around him other like-minded individuals, and they would read these philosophical texts that were perfectly available in the West, but they were sort of contraband in Russia at this time. So it was kind of like what do you want to call it? It was sort of like a stifled, the sort of the powers, the be, they wanted to kind of stifle the intellect in Russia at this time, and really, mute any kind of free thought. And then towards the end of the century, Solovyov, emerged from all this and as this kind of first true and official philosopher. And he makes his name by criticizing Western philosophy. His first book, The Crisis of Western Philosophy, it talks about, well, fundamentally, it talks about, again, what I was talking about earlier, and saying that I did an interview, and in the book I talk about the Russian soul a lot, and I did an interview for a Russian podcast, and the fellow was telling me how his girlfriend was laughing every time she read about the Russian soul, because it's this kind of cliche. But this is precisely what Solovyov was saying. What the West had lost sight of was the soul, was this inner being, and it was preoccupied and obsessed with purely practical and utilitarian aims and purposes, or with this kind of abstract characterization of the forms of knowledge, say in epistemology, if you know philosophy, someone like Kant. So, I mean, Kant will tell you how we can know something. But Solovyov says, well, thank you very much. You told me how I can know it, but what is it that I am knowing? And this is the thing where it stops. And utilitarian, practical, scientific philosophy was known as positivism at the time. It limited itself to just sensory data. So basically what could be, detected by the senses or tools aiding the senses. So any kind of metaphysical question or any kind of question of something like consciousness or, our inner world or being and all this sort of thing, the kinds of questions that religion pretty much had addressed or literature had addressed, they would say, well, we can't answer those kind of questions because they're meaningless, because we can't see it under the microscope or something like that. And again, for Solovyov, both of these approaches lose sight of what philosophy is actually after, and it's the love of wisdom. It's the philosophia, and that's what Sophia is in the middle there. And Solovyov had visions throughout his life of this feminine goddess, Sophia, who in the sort of esoteric Christian tradition, this is the divine wisdom. This is the feminine aspect of God that has been left out of the main story. You can find it, Sophia's in the Gnostic traditions. If you know this wonderful book, came out in the 70s, The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels. It tells you about this early form of Christianity that grew around the same time as what became the official Roman Church. But it was kind of this Gnostic church, and it was a very, very different approach, but it included this feminine aspect, which is called Sophia, which is wisdom in Greek. And there's various different traditions in which she falls from the spiritual realms and falls to earth and somehow gets trapped here. And we somehow release Sophia through our, meditation on her and contemplation and all this sort of thing. And Solovyov, when he was a child, when he was like 10 years old, he was in a church and he had this vision where he felt that he was caught up in this blue sky. He was kind of hovering in the shimmering blue sky. And then the sky took this feminine form of this woman, and it was Sophia. And then another time when he was actually here in London, and he was studying the Gnostics, these ancient Gnostic texts and other ancient texts at the British Museum. Used to have the old reading room there. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's what the British Library became. But there he had a vision of Sophia as well. And she told him to go to Egypt. And so he did, and he went to Cairo. And I always think it was a rather funny kind of picture because there he is there, and he's wearing a top hat and a frock coat, and he's walking on the outskirts of Cairo in the desert, and these Bedouins kind of capture him and tie him up, and then they rob him, and then they eventually let him go. But when he was there, he had one more vision of Sophia, and she came to him. And so this was something that informed his philosophy, but rather than become like a religious mystic, he used the tools of Western philosophy in order to basically show where Western philosophy had lost sight of its own object. It had lost touch with reality, either getting caught up in purely utilitarian, practical approaches, which in their own realm were perfectly fine and work wonderfully well. But they're not the whole of reality, and likewise this the abstract study of how we can know things. And so one of the things that Solovyov was very keen on doing, among many other things, I mean, he wrote these huge texts and a great many things, and he actually wrote poetry as well. And it sounds very heavy, but he actually had a sense of humor, and actually can read some of his poetry. At least I don't read Russian. I've never been to Russia, so I'm purely going by translations. But even some of the translations I've read, he has a sense of humor in some of the poetry. So he's there's a light side to him as well. And he was, again, one of these characters that Russia seems to produce, or could only have been produced in Russia. He was brilliant, but he was a wanderer. He lived what was called the kenotic path, and the kenosis is this kind of emptying that goes back to practices within the sort of Orthodox Church that go back to the monasteries at Mount Athos and to the early church fathers. It's a meditative path, sort of like Buddhism in some ways, where you empty yourself, you free yourself of your own ego and your selfhood. Again, both inwardly, but then in the outer world as well. So he gave away money. He didn't have a home. He wandered. He lived in different people's places. He died very young. But when he was a child, he imitated the lives of the saints, and he would sleep without a blanket and things like that. So again, this kind of extreme character. But he had his kind of overriding vision was of this kind of totality, this kind of synthesizing effect. Again, it's the we rather than the me, kind of bringing everything together. Integral philosophy. So the reality that the Western philosophy is missing could be apprehended through an integral vision, which would include the intellect, but also the soul and the emotions and the body all together in one package, rather than isolating just the intellect as the sole agent in the pursuit of truth and knowledge. But this also took, again, a kind of outward form, in the sense that he really tried to bring about a reunification of the Western and the Eastern Church. He approached the Pope at the time about it. He talked to the Tsar about it. He wrote at great length about it. And it seemed to be something that he really needed to do. And again, this is an example of this Russian universalism, because although it's easy to see it as a kind of Russian nationalism, yes, Russia is going to absorb the whole world. No, Russia will be the exemplar and will be kind of the beginning of this movement that will embrace the whole world in a kind of total, one planet, one people, one planet kind of vision. And yes, it'll be a Christian vision, but the Christian vision itself is one that is for all. It's universal. It's open to all. He even got to a point where he thought of starting a revolution to try and bring about this kind of actual, which if you saw that picture of him, it looks like, I don't know how we'd be able to do that. But then he gave up on that idea. And one of the last books he wrote, among many books, is War, Progress, and the End of History. It's a turnaround from precisely that idea. And he came to see that any kind of outward, actual external church, the kind of hierarchy that he envisioned with the Tsar at the head of it, but could too easily turn into sort of the kind of authoritarian system that Dostoyevsky portrays in the Grand Inquisitor chapter of the Brothers Karamazov, if you know that. And this is this wonderful parable where Christ comes back during the Inquisition, and he's arrested, and people aren't quite sure who he is, but the Grand Inquisitor knows who he is, and he's going to go and question him himself. And he basically says, "Why did you come back? You're just making lots of trouble here. We've had to, take care of these people, your followers for centuries now, telling them these fairy tales, because without us, they would not know what to do. They're sheep. Without us, they would be, left to themselves. And you to come back here now and to say they need to be free and to follow your path, that just upsets things and all that. And so there's this whole notion that, for our own good, because we are fallible, weak, fallen creatures who aren't able to, become the saints we really should be. The church takes on the burden of creating the system in which it can at least funnel us towards, some kind of, halfway decent kind of life. And this was something that at one point Solovyov saw as a potential good thing, but then he realized, no, it's too dangerous and it's just totalitarian, and he rejected it. And the three figures on the cover of the book is like, if you can see the cover, it's Solovyov is in the middle there, and the one in the foreground is Tolstoy, and one in the back is this next gentleman we're going to meet, Nikolai Fedorov. And Fedorov, again, is one of these characters that only Russia could have produced. Like Solovyov, he was a polymath. He knew everything. He was the illegitimate son of Prince Pavel Gagarin, and the Gagarin family goes back to the legendary Roerich, who's the Viking that the indigenous Slavs invited to come and rule us. So because we're too unruly, we can't rule ourselves, which is this other story that goes through Russian history. They're so chaotic that they need some outside force, or a very strong authoritarian character to bind them together. Hence, the Grand Inquisitor notion, this notion that we're just chaotic, unruly children, and we need some kind of strong figure. But he too was one of these characters that he led this wandering pilgrimage kind of life. He gave away everything he had. For many years, he worked at the Rumyantsev Museum, which was originally in St. Petersburg and was moved to Moscow. And there was this fantastic library in it, which I believe now makes up the Lenin Library or some of the Lenin Library. And he knew everything that was every book. There was like some 85,000 volumes in this library. He read every one. He could tell you what was in each one. If people would go there and, seeking information, he would bring them whatever books they wanted, then bring them another stack that, So if you were a student working on your thesis, you'd go to him and he would give you everything you needed, one-stop shop. But also he had this idée fixe, or this kind of what Isaiah Berlin would have called one big thing, one big idea. And it was the literal resurrection of the dead. And he didn't know how it would happen. He wasn't a biologist. He wasn't a scientist. He was what we would call a sage, a savant. He was someone who knew lots of things, but and a visionary. But he knew that once we recognized that this was the sole, task that we all need to get behind in order to accomplish, that it would come about. Somehow it would come about. I mean, this. I'm giving a talk about this next week. There's a series here called the London Month of the Dead. It happens every October, and I'm giving a talk about the cosmos and the resurrection of the dead. And I have to say, I've written about it a couple of times. Every time I start thinking about it, it's like, this is one of the craziest, wildest ideas you could ever possibly think of. But people like Tolstoy were impressed, were cowed by Fedorov. Fedorov sort of wagged his finger at Tolstoy once when Tolstoy made some remark when they were in the museum or something. Dostoyevsky wrote in his Diary of the Writer, about Fedorov's ideas and said that, they're remarkable and he agreed with them and all that. Although they all differed, because they, like many of us, if we think about this at all, we think of it in terms of some symbolic, resurrection or sort of metaphysical, spiritual, but the actual literal thing, they basically go back to him and say, like, do you really mean really literal? And he'd say, yeah, da. He'd say, yes. And then, so he got into arguments with Solovyov and all that, but this was this idée fixe that he had, and he had this whole vision around it. And then once the first person was brought back from the dead, science knew how to do that, then it would be our obligation, our responsibility, our duty to revive everyone else who died before. And so somehow this was going to lead to a way, again, thumbnail sketch, where we would have to collect what he called the ancestral dust. And this was the particles from all the bodies going back thousands of years. Because ultimately, he wanted to go back to Adam and Eve. I mean, he believed in the Adam and Eve story. Again, he was a very religious character, even though he took this, it's a very literal interpretation of the resurrection of the dead. He said, well, yes, we can do this. But he wanted to go back eventually to the Garden of Eden, which he believed was in the Pamir Mountains, and find the actual bones of Adam and Eve. So our number one original ancestor, having already revived all the ancestors in between. Okay, so that was going to happen, but that raised the question, where are we going to put them? Okay, there's no room on the planet, right? So that's why I have Sputnik over there, because part of this vision Fedorov had is like, well, once we've learned how to resurrect all the dead, we're going to have to go out into space to find other habitable planets in order to house them. So he's talking about space migration in 1880, 1890 and all that. He also believed that we need to be able to control the weather, regulate the weather. His vision of nature was not ecological in the sense that he respected nature and we have to, it was there for us to use. Actually, he saw nature and the actual universe as basically decaying. And if you know the second law of thermodynamics in science, what they call entropy, where any kind of organized energy eventually breaks down into chaos. And the amount of energy given off, the waste created is always greater than, the kind of order. And except the one thing that seems to resist that is life. And Fedorov is saying, no, life is the beginning of an anti-entropic kind of movement against this flow of decay, this flow of descent that he saw in the natural universe. So it was humanity's mission not only to revive the dead, but to actually gain control over nature and transform nature itself too. Resurrect nature, which is dying in this this decay, to be creative, make it creative. And this would include doing something like gaining control of the Earth's. I don't know how he managed to do it, but there was a character in the 60s, 70s named Buckminster Fuller, and he coined this term "spaceship Earth." And it was one of the early kind of pictures of the planet as a total, organism, or as a total kind of unity. We're all traveling on spaceship Earth. Well, Fedorov had that idea well before Buckminster Fuller, but he actually literally thought of traveling. He thought we'd be able to somehow control the Earth's gravitational field, or whatever you want to call it, take it out of its orbit, and it would go through the universe. It would go, boldly go where no planet's gone before. And so, again, so the character in the middle here is a guy named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And as a teenager, he sat at Fedorov's feet, and Fedorov was sitting, at his desk at the Rumyantsev Museum. When he wasn't sleeping, when he slept at the Rumyantsev, he slept on a chest, a kind of humpback chest, with the book as a pillow. So a pillow. So this guy was an ascetic, in overdrive. And but when Fedorov was talking about the need to travel out into space in order to find habitable planets to house the revived dead, Tsiolkovsky is thinking, well, how can we actually do that? And he, for about 3 years, I think he was there, and then stories went back to his father that he was starving, he was poor, so his father actually came, I forget from what town, not close to Moscow, came and took him back. And in the long run, he spent many, many years drawing up all these plans and diagrams that eventually turned into Sputnik. And he had all these ideas. Like in 1903, he was writing about what we call rocket science, when in 1904, the Wright brothers was just getting off with Kitty Hawk. And he devised like the first wind tunnel, but he too had these strange ideas, from our perspective, of the universe as already living and conscious. And it had its own kind of teleology. It had its own purpose of movement in advance. And again, Westerners think of themselves having free will, and we can make our own choices here, but no, actually we're part of this great cosmic kind of system that has its own aims and purposes that override our own. And he sort of saw this kind of vision of an intelligent universe moving in a particular direction, and so on and so on. So these visions of getting out into space were aligned with, again, this kind of cosmic. And that's why the school came to be known as the Cosmos, because they had this, and there are a few other ones I'm not mentioning here, but they saw human life not only in a social, political, even an ecological context, but in the cosmic one. So events in cosmic space, like cosmic rays, or there was one who talked about effects of sunspots on human activity. So again, this is another example of, in the West, we think, I make my own decisions, but no, you're part of this vast we that overrides yours. And I have this kind of, cyborg S down at the bottom there, because a lot of the ideas of Fedorov and Tsiolkovsky and the other cosmists have become repackaged, resurrected, dare I say, in the transhumanist movement and the post-humanist movement, because they too talk about not necessarily reviving the dead, but immortality, of overcoming death, and also space migration and space travel and all that. So, and these guys are very often cited. And within Russia themselves, they've become very, very popular again since the post-Soviet time. I don't know where I am on time, if I'm, because I've got quite a bit more here. I'm going kind of slow. I'll move it along a little quickly here. But these are the God Seekers. And this is Dmitry Merezhkovsky and Zanadia Gippius. And they were sort of the kind of the high priest and high priestess of the symbolist movement in Russia at the time. And Merezhkovsky was And yeah, they were called the God Seekers in the sense that, you know, they, again, it was this kind of intense, deeply earnest pursuit of the holy, or what Solovyov called God-manhood. He gave a series of lectures on the God-man, which is different than the man-God. The man-God is the Western idea of the practical scientist who's able to control nature, and well, sort of like Fedorov was saying. But so it's man as he is deified. It should be the humanist kind of, you know, or even the transhumanist kind of perspective. But the God-man is we becoming more godlike in the sense of, you know, we're made in God's image. So, you know, like one of the things Solovyov did that got him into trouble is that he asked Alexander III to forgive the assassins of his father. And this should be a remarkable example of Russian Christian love and clemency and all that. And it didn't happen, but this would have been an example of God-manhood, being able to rise above your personal, you know, notions of revenge or anything like that in order to, you know, show mercy and love towards, you know, your enemies and all that. So that's sort of an example. But they were kind of like, you kind of want to say they were kind of like hipsters. They were like the head of the kind of hip, cool group in the Symbolists there. They started something called the, what is it, the Religious Philosophical Society, where people would meet up and talk about these sorts of things. And sorry, I'm losing track of my pages here. Where am I? And sorry, give me a second here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, Merkovsky was a novelist, philosopher, and historian, religious prophet. He wrote books about Atlantis. So this was another kind of, you know, vision of something reviving from the past, from the primitive path, coming back now. Christ and sex. Again, here's another example of this kind of union of the spiritual and the sensual. There was a lot of preoccupation with Christ's fleshy nature. I mean, if he had a real human body, and did he participate in all real, you know, human? I mean, how could he be truly human if he didn't, you know, feel sexual desire and all that kind of thing? And there was a sort of revival of pagan ideas and a deification of the body, which sex in some way, again, sort of in a tantric tradition. You can find some of the things in the East, and you can also find it in Western sorts of traditions too. The Moravians, can't go into, but I've written about them. But where sex is somehow a transformative agent. It transforms, it transfigures. So the body becomes transfigured, becomes saintly through it and all that. And they also put out a journal called Novi Put. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. The New Path. So this was the New Age, the New Way, this new vision forward. And again, it's a kind of response or reaction to the previous utilitarian, practical, radically ruthless Western ideas of the new men of the previous generation. And so they went, you know, and you can see in a kind of pendulum, this further kind of religious kind of mystical swing. And again, in keeping what was happening in the rest of Europe at the time. But again, they kind of wore their spirituality on their sleeve in a sense. They were very visible about it. And there's a story that they made a pilgrimage to Lake Svetloyar, which is the site of the invisible city of Kitez, if you know the story. When the Mongols are attacking and they come upon the city, and there's no defense, you know, there's no army out to stop them. They just hear kind of people within chanting and all this, and they get enraged at this. They think, oh, these pusillanimous Christians, they're not even going to defend their city. And then as they go to attack, fountains of water appear, and waves and jets and streams, and the city descends into the lake. And it's kind of like a mini Atlantis in a way. So I didn't even think of that, but it's a nice kind of segue there. And again, it's in a way, it's kind of like Camelot. It's sort of like, you know, Lady in the Lake sort of thing. When the need is there, when the need arises, it will come back up, and it'll be a sign of the new age and so on, and that kind of thing. And symbolism in a general kind of sense, as I said before, was this kind of, it was a way of making and vague and elusive and dreamy. And it was the notion somehow you could communicate through levels, subliminal levels, not the conscious mind. So these symbols, I mean, it's kind of symbol isn't something you figure out intellectually. It's something that has a kind of effect on you. And it might not even be something you understand in language, but you can feel it in some way. It's a kind of tacit, implicit, almost visceral kind of meaning. And there was the notion that life imitates art. You can transform life through art. So art wasn't about representing life. It was about using the creative imagination to transform life itself. And some of the people here who were doing that was Konstantin Balmont. He was a very important poet and a translator. Just some quick notes. He had just real, very, very quick notes here. I mean, he had a extensive life. He traveled quite a bit. He was exiled from Russia twice, but eventually it was madness in his family. He went mad and he died in Nazi-occupied France. There's Alexander Bloch. He was a very influential poet. He was influenced by Solovyov, and he married the daughter of Dmitry Mendeleev, who's a famous Russian scientist. He is associated with this notion of the beautiful lady. And again, this is a kind of Sophia theme, where these, again, it's kind of Arthurian in a way, or like the troubadour. There were these women who were held to be these symbols of purity, of the ideal, women on a pedestal. And one of those for Bloch was his wife, so he didn't have sexual relations with her because he didn't want to sully the ideal, but he had affairs on the side. And someone we'll get on to next, the novelist Andrzej Bieli fell in love with Bloch's wife as well. And so all these kind of usual, soap opera triangles were happening all the time when the high-mindedness was going on at the same time, because everybody's human, so you can't fault them for that. But he almost wound up having a duel with Bloch over this. And Bloch was the first enthusiastic about the revolution, and he wrote this famous poem called The 12, which is about Jesus and the apostles, but they're made out to be these Bolshevik comrades who were walking through the streets of St. Petersburg while the revolution's going on. So it's a very different, happy tidings, it's a very different kind of gospel. This is a painting called The Man Who Fell in Love with a Demon by Mikhail Vrubel. And somebody else who is one of these symbolist painters. Most of the painters have this dreamy kind of character to them, and they're not very precise strokes. It's it's kind of this mushy kind of way with the brush. And he started out as a Christian, working on cathedrals and chapels and doing renovations of icons and things of that sort. And then he wound up becoming a Satanist. So he covered both extremes. And he's another one in which there was mental instability, and he died in a mental asylum. And last on here is a illustration called Devil by Mstislav Dobozinski, who was a painter and a decorator. And this was for a contest put on by a magazine called The Golden Fleece, Zoloto Runo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. This was published by an art dealer and a critic named Nikolai Ryabushinsky, who, again, he's in another slide. But he, in the magazine, he ran a contest for the best illustration on the theme of the devil. And that takes us to the next, well, one of the devils here. Satanism was something that was very popular at this time too. It was part of this transgressive atmosphere, and the whole notion of the opposite, so this antinomian. So, with the black mass is basically the Catholic mass where the cross is upside down and you have sex on the altar. And it's just, it's if you ever see these old 70s witchcraft or black magic movies, that's about the best you're gonna get of like what the black mass might have been. It's the old Hammer ones, if you know about them either. But two characters here this is Valery Byusov, who was a novelist, poet, critic, and a very, very important figure on the symbolist scene. He was a real careerist, a real career literary man, and he took pains to develop his kind of satanic vision. He had natural mongoloid features, but he trimmed his beard to have this kind of Mephistophelian kind of beard and arched the eyebrows and all that. And he was a very haughty, dominant character. And he wrote this fantastic novel called The Fiery Angel. I have that edition up there because I wrote an afterword to it. And it's a novel that takes place in, I think, 15th century Germany, and it's about witchcraft and Satanism then. But what Berdyaev did was transpose a love triangle between himself, the poet Nina Petrovskaya, and Andrei Biely, who, just before I was saying, he fell in love with Alexander Bloch's wife, and they got into a kind of magical duel. But Berdyaev depicted it in this novel, and Prokofiev based his opera, The Fiery Angel, on novel as well. And Berdyaev is like, he's not a symbolist in the way that Biely is. Biely is one, if you read Petersburg, it's this hallucinatory novel. And it's full of influences from Steiner and Theosophy, and about, astral travel and auras and dreams and different times and all this strange kind of stuff. And it really, if you read several pages of it, if you read it like for a length of time, at least I found it created this kind of hallucinatory effect. But Berdyaev has this kind of precision. He has this very hard precision. And I think his inspiration is more the French Romantics than the simplest, people like Gautier, or maybe people like Huysmans, who wrote the famous novel Against Nature, which starts the decadent movement in France. It's a meticulous attention to detail and very fine line writing, but he's able to recreate this 15th century Germany and sort of transpose this love triangle to it there. But he was very, very influential, and he was important in promoting symbolism, as a whole kind of movement, and wasn't spiritual in the way that Biely was. Biely became under the influence of Rudolf Steiner. He's one of the people who left Russia for a while and went to Switzerland and worked on this fantastic building called the Goethe Anum, which I'm sorry I don't have an illustration of it here, but it's called the Goethe Anum because Steiner was influenced by the German poet Goethe, and but the building itself was this remarkable Art Nouveau expressionist. It looked like an organic being because there was no straight lines, and everything was curved, and nothing repeated itself. It was all a little bit different. So it gave the impression that it was moving and growing. The original one was made of wood, and that's the one that Biely worked on while World War I was going on. And one of the things that was happening with Steiner, the people building this Goethe Anum came from all the warring nations. So you had Austrians and Germans and English and French and Russians there, all in Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, working on this building. So it was a kind of, in a way, it was a kind of expression of the universalism that the Russians were thinking of. But he had a falling out with Steiner eventually, and his wife left him, and she stayed there in Switzerland. She didn't return to Russia. But if you read Petersburg, and you have an idea of what he was hearing Steiner lecture about, you can see the different aspects of the way he creates the effects in there. But I mentioned Satan, and he was very, very popular. This is a picture of Fedor Chelyapin. He was an opera singer, and he was known for his performance as Mephistopheles in Gounod's opera Faust. And this is, if you know the Goethe's play, Mephistopheles is this kind of dark, he's evil, but he's very witty, he's cunning, he's clever, and he presents the devil as a kind of attractive kind of character. He's intelligent, he's more intelligent than Faust and all this sort of thing. And also at the same time, there was an import from England, this kind of the Byronic vision of Lucifer, Lord Byron, the poet who shakes his fist, and it's this kind of brooding, romantic kind of character. And there's something across the board was very, very popular. I couldn't find any examples of some of the magazines that had covers, but lurid, popular magazines had lurid covers of kind of satanic figures and damsels in distress, getting half their clothes ripped off or something like that. So, much like pulp magazines would be doing in the 20s and 30s in the West. So it was very popular at the time. The character next to Charlie Oppenheimer is Alexander Scriabin, who was one of the great composers. He was a theosophist. He didn't, depending on your taste, he didn't live to complete his last major work. It was a mass. But he was one of these people that was very influenced by this idea of synesthesia that I mentioned earlier, where the different senses combine. And so he developed something he called the color organ. So it was like one of the early light show effects. So when he performed his music, his symphonies, different chords, different colors would be projected on a screen, sort of behind the orchestra that corresponded to Scriabin in different esoteric sort of theosophical reasons with different colors. But he also wanted to incorporate scent, like a smell, perfume coming in. But he did write things like the poem of fire, the poem of ecstasy, and it's kind of like Bolero, but wilder and crazier, where everything is pulsing and building up to a kind of crescendo, a kind of climax. And he wrote a poem satanique, and this his night piano sonata was sort of nicknamed the Black Mass. If you look online for the Scriabin Museum, they talk about a painter friend of his, fellow named Nicholas Sperling, and there is a painting. I forget the name of it right now, but it's a sage or something like this. It's kind of Oriental sage. But Sperling apparently was an artist at this time who also had deep interest in Satanism and black magic. But there were stories that he was actually a cannibal as well, or that he went out on, or during World War I, he would should we say, ingest some of the flesh of the wounded, the dead, let's hope, in the trenches there. I don't know how true this is, but this is the kind of thing that would have been really cool to tell people you were doing at this time. And this is Nikolai Ryobushinsky, who was the art collector and critic who ran a suicide club called the Black Swan. My joke is, how did they keep up their membership? But he's also the one who published this magazine called the Golden Fleece, and held the contest for the best illustration of the devil. But not everybody around that time had this dramatic, romantic, transgressive notion of the devil. And one of those who didn't was Ouspensky, who, if you know him, you know him as this exponent of this teacher Gurdjieff's work. But before he did that, he wrote short stories and novels in Russia at this time. And he has these two sort of long stories or novellas that are called Talks with the Devil. And the devil in them turns out to be this kind of seedy, tawdry kind of character. And if you know how Dostoyevsky portrays the devil in Brothers Karamazov, it's sort of like that. So he isn't this Byronic romantic figure. He's a kind of mediocre kind of character that talks too much and is not to be trusted. So not everybody was taken in by that romantic kind of vision. But on the other side, you have these spiritual advisors. So you have the devil, and you have sort of, if not saints, but at least people that were trying to give spiritual advice it's Nicholas and Alexandra at this time. But mostly Alexandra, she's the one who was open to this. I mean, Nicholas wasn't, he was open because he was always found himself going along with Alexandra. He really couldn't stand up to her. This is one of the things, and he just wanted to have a quiet life, anything for a quiet life. So if the wife wants to, okay, let's get Rasputin, if that's what she wants. And so the first one here is a fellow named Gerard Encausse, who is a French, very important French writer on occultism, and he belonged to a number of different Masonic and occult and Hermetic and societies, and he also belonged to what was known as a Martinist society. And Martinism is something again that developed in the 19th century, late 19th century. It's a sort of an offshoot of Masonry, and it was developed by a French spiritual philosopher who was known as the unknown philosopher, but people found him out, Louis Claude de Saint-Martin. And earlier in the century, Saint-Martin's writings were very influential on Alexander I. And when he was getting involved with the Holy Alliance, and Franz von Baader was another character at that time. I'm not talking about them now, but there were related influences on Alexander I at this time, when the notion of Holy Russia once again became this kind of real identity that Russia had after, especially after Napoleon. And yes, he first met Nicholas Alexander in Paris, where he greeted them on behalf of French spiritualists. Alexandria had the interest in spiritualism. It's very popular among the aristocracy on the continent and England too. One of the famous mediums of the time, Daniel Douglas Hume, was someone who visited the royal family in Russia and the courts of kings on the continent. So it wasn't particularly exceptional. And it was something that, and even in sort of upper class families or middle class families, table turning, seances, things of that sort became kind of amusements. Some people took it seriously, other ones were doing it for fun. Just, I guess, like today, you might go to a fortune teller or read your astrology, your horoscope in the newspaper. And but Pappas at one point raised the spirit of Nicholas's follower, Alexander III, and he claimed that the spirit predicted that Nicholas would lose his throne to a revolution. And Ancos was known as Pappas. This was his sort of pseudonym, his pen name. And he said that as long as he was alive, he would be able to hold this revolution off. And a similar thing was said by Rasputin. And Rasputin said that if the peasants kill me, it's okay. You'll stay in power, and things will be good. But if the aristocracy kills me, then catastrophe is on its way. There'll be a revolution. And oddly enough, Pappas and Rasputin died within weeks of each other. They're very close. And not too long after, this is when things started to go downhill for Nicholas. So, coincidence, or did they know that something was happening? This was Master Philip. He was sort of the healer who was on the scene before Rasputin. The same person who introduced Rasputin to Alexandria introduced Master Philip. This was Grand Duchess Mstislav. And he was an associate of Pappas. He's someone, again, who had healing powers with the thaumaturge. I mean, he had other powers as well. He was supposed to be hypnotic, be able to go into trance states and clairvoyant and things of that sort. But I think the main thing that Master Philip had going for him was what they call thaumaturgy, laying on of hands. You lay on the hands and you have a healing effect, is what Rasputin did. One of his predictions didn't go that well. He predicted that Alexandria would have a son. So far, she'd only produced daughters for Nicholas, and he was getting impatient with her. And she was so excited by this and happy about it that she went into what was known as a phantom pregnancy. She showed all the signs of pregnancy, but nothing, was there, put it bluntly, when the time came. And strangely enough, Master Philip didn't lose his standing, although Alexandria sort of pressed Nicholas to give him this position as a medical, an official medical position, when he didn't possess any kind of, credentials or that. And eventually he was rivals. I mean, there's always rivals in the court. There's others, going on trying to, everyone wants to get in good with the Tsar. So he was eventually shipped back to France, but they kept in touch with him until he died in 1905. And then just quickly, these two other figures here. This is Prince Esper Ukhtomsky. He was a practicing Buddhist and a theosophist. And when Nicholas took a tour of India, he accompanied him. And on that tour, they visited the theosophical headquarters in Adyar. And this is where, after starting in New York, Madame Blavatsky moved it to India in the late 70s, and then it remained there. And the main headquarters is still there to this day. And I mean, there's a fantastic story about Theosophical Society in India with people like Annie Besant being involved in Indian independence and all that. But they met Colonel Olcott, who was Madame Blavatsky's old colleague. She had died in 1891. And there's a book by Berdyaev, who I mentioned before, with Uspensky, called Meetings with Remarkable Men. And one of the characters in there is supposed to be based on Tomsky. And this last gentleman here, Zamzar and Badmaev, he practiced Tibetan medicine. And again, this was a time of the Great Game. This is when Russia and Great Britain were playing this kind of chess game in India, around the Himalayas and Nepal and Tibet and all that, and jockeying for power, a sphere of influence, the Trans-Siberian Railway. That's something, one of the stories with Fedorov about being at the library is when engineers who were going to work on the Trans-Siberian Railway, he said, let me see your maps. And he said, oh, actually, no, that's wrong, that's wrong. And then like 2 years later, when they came back, they told him, yep, you were right. So he knew their maps were wrong. So when so he even knew what they were doing when they were laying out the railway. Amazing. So there was this whole Eastern influence, which I didn't go into now. I mean, there was a fellow named Berdyaev, who was a Buryat Russian Buddhist, who was actually petitioned the Tsar to be able to build a Buddhist temple in St. Petersburg, and he actually was able to do it. Sadly, it opened just as the revolution was happening, and it was shut down, and he was eventually, he was a tutor to one of the Dalai Lamas, I think the 13th Dalai Lama, but he wound up in one of Stalin's, cells, and was never heard of again. But again, the whole notion of this Russian Asia was a theme that's very, very popular and important at this time too. So I'll just quickly go through these, or is that, do you want to leave time for questions or?
Yeah, maybe we could, do you think you could address a couple of questions that might?
Yeah, I mean, I'm again, that's Berdyaev, he's someone we talk about in there. Just to say how I wound up doing the book.
Yes.
I wound up doing the book because I did this other book called Dark Star Rising, which is about this strange kind of occult politics happening around Trump, but also around Putin and other places in the world, having to do with the alt-right, and it's a long story. But I thought, I did a lot of research on Russia, and I had all this other stuff, and I thought, I'd like to do something with that. I didn't know exactly what to do. And then I saw an article about an address Putin gave to United Russia, the main political party in Russia. Excuse me, I think it was in 2014, in which he gave a reading list to his regional governors. And on the reading list were two of the philosophers, I didn't get to talk about Berdyaev, but two of the philosophers that were very important from this Silver Age. And this was part of this, what Putin seemed to be doing was, well, not seemed to be, he was doing this. He was reaching back to this pre-Soviet time when there was this wonderful flowering of creativity and thought and spirituality and all this, and recapturing that to help provide Russia with this new identity, or an old identity. Russia was going through an identity crisis since, well, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in the first place, I thought it was interesting that whoever was doing this, to give very heavy-duty philosophical books to your regional governors to read, I thought, well, that's good. I can't imagine what books Trump tells anybody to read, his own, I suspect, So, I mean, good for them in the first place. But then I saw that Western critics, David Brooks specifically in the New York Times, he was seeing this as a gesture towards not Russian universalism, but Russian exceptionalism. And he was seeing Solovyov and Berdyaev as these nationalist, pro-Russian thinkers who had this vision of Russia basically, taking over the world, basically, to put it simply. And I thought that was incorrect. Whatever use Putin may be making of them is one thing, but what Berdyaev and Solovyov are talking about, and Berdyaev himself is very much against all this kind of Russian messianic stuff, the Third Rome notion, all this kind of thing. So it's not even in his work. So I just thought this was incorrect. And then, and so I thought there was something worth, I thought they were saying something, these philosophers are important in their own right. And that Putin was representing them was interesting. And so this was part of this gesture that he was making to revive this notion of Holy Russia, to give Russia, to revive against the decadent West, the West where everything is permissive. It's this me economy in the West. Everything is available in the West. You can get whatever you want. From gender to anything else, you could just change and decide what you want to be. And Russia is presenting itself as this traditional, civilization, with traditional gender roles and traditional family roles and, place of religion and the church and society and all that. And that seemed to be the new Cold War that was, happening. It wasn't about capitalism versus, or democracy versus communism, or capitalism communism. It was against this kind of ultra hyper permissive West and this more traditional East. And I thought, even though I reject kind of Putin's vision of that, I think many of the ideas that these people were saying at the Silver Age, they were directing them towards the West, and I think the West needed to hear them, but it was cut short by the Soviets. So we have an opportunity to hear these ideas now, because I think many of the criticisms that Solovyov and others were making at the West still we've only got even more utilitarian and practical and all that now. And I mean, I can't really go into the details of the philosophies, but I think they still have something to offer to us. And that's why I thought, it would be an opportunity to try to get that across and write the book. All right, so that's it.